7 decades ago, the first television adaptation of Superman arrived. Now, it's time to rocket back to the 1952 to 1958 series Adventures of Superman, starring George Reeves. In this rewatch podcast, my guests and I break down each episode, from its black and white crime drama beginnings to the kid-friendly color seasons, as we celebrate one of the most underrated Man of Steel depictions of all time. Welcome to another exciting episode in the Adventures of Superman. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss Season 1, Episode 11, No Holds Barred, his first-time guest, my dear friend, Rich Roney. Welcome.
Hey, hello everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Of course, you've been on my other Superman podcast, Digging for Kryptonite, a bunch of times, including for a couple of Adventures of Superman-themed episodes, which I have referenced a number of times on this podcast, because those couple of episodes that we did a couple of years ago now really just got me so excited about and interested in Adventures of Superman. And I just felt, I left those episodes feeling like there's more for us to do, more for us to explore. And then eventually that gave rise to this rewatch podcast. So I'm really excited to have you on for this one. Again, this is No Holds Barred, Season 1, Episode 11. Aired November 28th, 1952, written by Peter Dixon and directed by Lee Sholem. Here is my synopsis of the episode, a little bit of an overview, and then later in our episode, we'll give a more detailed scene-by-scene breakdown. Wrestler Bad Luck Brannigan, who fights for a crooked promoter named Murray, puts 7 men in the hospital with a mysterious paralyzer hold. Perry White enlists college wrestling champ Wayne Winchester to study Brannigan's moves, which are really pressure point techniques coerced out of Ram, a quote-unquote Swami held captive by Murray. When Wayne, who has expressed romantic interest in Lois, accepts a challenge to fight Brannigan, Clark, with knowledge obtained by Superman, helps Wayne train for the big bout. I'm really excited to get into this episode, but before that, let's talk a bit about your history with Adventures of Superman. And now we covered a lot of this when you were on Digging for Kryptonite, but for anyone maybe who hasn't listened to those episodes, or even if they did, it's been a little while. How old were you, and what era are we talking about when you first encountered Adventures of Superman?
Okay, so I'm very close to the original run. I'm 67, right? I was born in 1956 when the show was first run. I probably started watching this when I lived in Chicago, and I probably watched it as much as I could, say from 1962 to 1966, 67, right? Now, one thing I will say, and Anthony, you alluded to this, we did kind of a macro level review of the first 2 seasons a couple of years ago, but that was very broad. So I was thrilled. And well, when I was a child watching it, say 8, 9, 10 years old, there was a greater display of the latter color seasons. I really think that at that point in time, especially in the village I lived in, it was a suburb of Chicago, and I think they kind of sanitized it. I think there were some episodes from the first season they deliberately didn't show because I thought they were too dark or might be too scary for young children. So I grew up more with the color seasons, where it was a different Superman. The first season was more, I think this was even listed in TV Guide as a crime drama. And just like yourself, when we touched on this over a couple of years ago, it was a macro level review. I was kind of flippant. I figured, I'll watch a couple and I'll go off memory. And just like yourself, I have really immensely enjoyed digging, no pun intended, but really peeling the layers of the onion back and studying some of these individual episodes. It's been marvelous. And I think we're going to get into this. We're going to compliment, I think, 2 things. George Reeves as an actor and what he accomplished. But also as I watch some of these things, what they did on such a shoestring budget and with tight time constraints, I'm so impressed with some of the ideas they presented in a 23-minute episode. So I'm excited about this. I have not watched No Holds Barred since we looked at it over 2 years ago. So I rewatched it just a few days ago. Watched it twice. some things disappointed me. Some things I enjoyed immensely more.
Gotcha. You bring up an idea that's come up in a lot of these discussions, and it's always worth mentioning. I think it's easy to look at this show, and especially this first season, which is very dark and very gritty, and in some intense sequences of violence for what is, otherwise a kid show. But I think it can be easy to look at this show and see its limitations in terms of budget, production value, technology, right? To kind of see the seams literally in certain cases. But what I'm struck by far more than anything else is just what they were able to accomplish within the constraints that they had. And I think so much of this still holds up. And that's why it's worth revisiting and celebrating. Now, a couple of things that I want to ask you, just big picture, because one thing that I've been discussing on both podcasts is how formative our first introductions to characters can be for us. And we certainly know plenty of people, right, who were so molded as Superman fans by the Christopher Reeve depiction. But there was this whole earlier generation who you're a part of, right, who had George Reeves. And so I'm just curious, and I don't know if this is something that you've pondered in depth, but to what extent did the George Reeves depiction shape how you view the character or what you look for in a presentation of Superman or a Superman story?
So I will share this, and this always baffled me at the time I was watching these shows, because in that exact same window of time, say 1962, and from there on, I really watched this show for maybe 5-6 years, predominantly in the summer as reruns. I don't remember it really being broadcast in the winter. I think it was more like, hey, kids are out of school. This will give the mothers a little quiet time before the kids get crazy. But there was, I thought, almost a polar opposite portrayal. What George Reeves did, and I love his rendition, his portrayal of Clark Kent. To me, that's more important than his portrayal of Superman. I really like his Clark is authoritative, decisive, but that was the antithesis of what was presented in the comics at that time. Clark in the comics was more deliberately timid or a milquetoast, or would avoid, come up with clever excuses to run away from trouble so he could change to Superman to solve. So it was a complete polar opposite between the two. I always was far more impressed with the George Reeves kind of assertive, confident, decisive Clark Kent. That appealed to me more, and still does.
So when you got to the Richard Donner movie with Christopher Reeve, and I know it's a performance we all love and respect and appreciate, but did you bump up against that depiction of Clark at all because it was so divorced from what you had seen as a kid growing up with George Reeves?
Yes. I mean, I definitely watched, well, as bluntly as possible, I definitely watched in the theaters at the time the first two Christopher Reeve portrayals. I remember working in Phoenix when the one with Richard Pryor came out, and candidly, I was tempted just to get up and leave the theater. Now, there was a close, I think, linear consistency with the George Reeves, and I've said this a few times before. In my mind, Clark is the real deal. Superman is just an extension of Clark. He's just an extension. Clark is the one that is decisive and analytical and, is willing to jump into things. This is in the TV show, The Adventures of Superman. Conversely, I enjoyed Christopher Reeve's portrayal of Superman as a character, but I don't think the settings of the Donner films for the supporting characters hold up well. I don't even think they were consistent with the time in which they were there. They were kind of a little over the top, a little tongue-in-cheekish. to me didn't hold up well. Now, again, I liked the Christopher Reeves portrayal, and I compliment both those guys as actors. I've watched these things, and as you said on one of your interviews, you said something like, nobody knew that 70 years from now, people would have much bigger screens and be able to time stop it and look in the background and see what some of this the background information was. But each of those actors, I think, knocked it out of the park with their respective portrayals.
Well said. And one of the things that I keep coming back to, the deeper that I dig, again, no pun intended, into all of this, is how there's room for different interpretations, and I would argue that everything that we've seen takes a different approach, right, in terms of the acting and the writing and directing, but really for the most part still retains the core. Like, there are different ways to approach it, and you see that.
And one last thing, you and I were having lunch with about 4 or 5 other guys years ago at Venetian, and we just somehow, you and I started talking off on the side. And this was, I think, even before you started doing any podcasts. But I said, in my mind, George Reeves is always the golden age Superman, and Christopher Reeve is the Silver Age. And I think that assignment holds up well.
I do think that is apt, for sure. I love. We've had a version of this conversation on the other podcast. We've had many versions of this conversation off mic, but I always love to talk about this with you, and especially to capture it for another exciting episode here, because I was saying this to you off mic. I've had a bunch of great guests on the show so far. To my knowledge and recollection, you're the first one who really grew up watching the show and watching it in the original era that it aired. Again, you weren't watching it in that first run in the 50s, but you were watching it in the 60s, very close, far earlier than everyone else I've spoken to. One common theme in a lot of these episodes so far, a lot of people, myself included, started experiencing the show in a more significant, meaningful way in the mid-2000s when Superman Returns came out, and Warner Brothers put out a ton of Superman content on DVD, including Adventures of Superman. So, to hear from someone like yourself, who's like a real, like, legit OG Adventures of Superman fan, it's really cool. And I mean, I guess anything else you could share, I would love to hear just about I don't know, like, what was the feeling like when you were, again, I know you said it was more in the summer, but like, if you were out and you knew you were heading home to watch an episode, like, what were those feelings like? What was the anticipation heading into getting to see a new episode of this?
Well, and granted, I'm going back over 60 years from a memory standpoint, but I do remember my brother and I would, at a certain point in the afternoon, kind of know, like, hey, we got to get home, right? Because it's gonna be on at 4 o'clock, right? And they would only show one show a day, right? We were at the mercy of whatever the moral criteria the station manager had. There's a couple of episodes that I never saw until 2 years ago. And I'm sorry, what is it, like the Evil 3, or there's something about like Mystery in Wax. I don't ever remember seeing those, ever. There was much more a frequency of the color episodes from the last 4 seasons. It was more exciting. There were definitely some from the first season, and you could really tell George Reeves was more trim, more athletic. It was more action oriented. Towards the end, he started doing karate chops. I'm sorry, and I digressed off. I know we made it a point as much as possible to be home to watch this. And there was a synergy between my brother and I, and perhaps 1 or 2 other kids in the neighborhood, where the interest in the show triggered interest in buying either Action Comics or Superman comics or Adventure Comics with Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes. So there really was a synergy and interaction between the two that I look back on fondly.
Did either of your parents ever watch it?
No.
Did they have any opinion about you watching it?
It's funny you say that. And I do remember as a child, and granted, it's a different world. I can remember vividly when our TV broke or failed work, and my dad had to take it to a shop to get it repaired. And we didn't have a TV for 3 weeks. And my brother and I were just climbing the walls. But my parents grew up at a time, and my dad was very content to just listen to the radio, listen to a ball game on the radio. And now, granted, that was the environment in which he grew up. Look, I've got 3 brothers and a sister, so my mom was always more oriented on, especially at the time this was coming on, 4 in the afternoon. She was more like, I got to get dinner ready. I got to, do certain things, maybe give, the baby the bath and just get everything organized prior to my dad getting home around 6. So my parents never, I do remember, Anthony, sincerely, and we might have touched on this. The first comic I ever really owned, I remember trying to get my dad to read it to me. And he just he wasn't a bully or mean or anything, but he just didn't connect with comics. He was a World War II chief petty officer. It just wasn't, it wasn't in his wheelhouse.
No, I understand. Now that comic, this is the issue of World's Finest, yes?
Yes.
Which I know we've talked about,
143.
143. I always want to say 142, but it's 143. Did that come before you started watching Adventures of Superman? Was your introduction to Superman the comic first or the show first?
The show first. The show first. And what captivated, I mean, really reached out and grabbed me was seeing Superman on the cover, but then also this other guy that was kind of the same height and physical build, but he was in the gray and the blue cape. But I can remember the show was my first introduction, and that made me much more conscious of if we went to a drugstore or a train station and they had comics displayed, Superman was very prominent. And I think at one time, I don't know if it was 40 million issues a year or more than that. I think Lois Lane per month did like 500,000, 480,000 printed copies. So when you think he was, maybe that's 1 month, and then there was seven or eight titles with Superman in it. It's staggering, and the economic scale or the mathematical scale. Now a book today, they're happy if they get 30,000 out of it. Listen, in 1966. Green Lantern alone did like 325,000 issues a month. It's such a different world.
I know it's so crazy to think about. Just a couple of last questions about your experience generally before we really dig into No Holds Barred. One is, I know you mentioned that it was primarily those color episodes that you were seeing. Were you seeing them in color? Did you guys have a color TV?
No. It was black and white. It was black and white. You could absolutely tell the texture was different. We had a black and white set. I think we got the first color set for my family, maybe 68 or 69. That being said, you could clearly see the texture and the background and the portrayal. You could tell the costume was different for the latter 4 seasons versus the first 2.
Gotcha.
I do remember, though, say being 6 years old or something like that and wondering, well, when I would watch the TV show, why doesn't he call his buddy Batman for help or something like this? So my young brain had a hard time realizing that the setting and the environment for the comics was one thing versus the setting for the TV show.
Listen, I can identify. So I host a number of podcasts. One of them is devoted to Power Rangers. It's called Summoning the Zords. I don't anticipate there's a ton of overlap in the audiences of this show, and that's okay. But what you have described as far as your experience with Adventures of Superman, watching it as a little kid, being excited for it, having these memories as an adult that you sort of have to reconcile and maybe half remembering certain things, not sure if your memory lines up with what it actually was. That's what I've been experiencing now and going back and watching these old Power Rangers things, right? That I watched 30 years ago as a little kid. And it's fascinating to see it with new eyes. And in my case, it's not even so much that there were episodes that I missed. I think I pretty much seen everything, but so much that I had forgotten or just you view it one way as a kid and then you just come at it from a completely different perspective. And it's really been fascinating. So, I use the Power Rangers example because it's like, I can imagine what it's been like for you over these past couple of years since we did our macro level discussion. And now this, to go back to this stuff that you spent time with as a little kid, but then maybe not for decades. So I know what a fascinating experience and process it can be.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the last question is, I have always had many questions for you, but for right now, you mentioned your dad like listening to the radio and everything. Did you listen to the Superman radio show?
No.
Okay.
I think the radio show ceased being broadcast in the early 50s.
Okay.
Now, I think the tremendously fascinating thing is, and I want to let you expand on this, I think you read parts of that book, Superman Serial to Serial, right? I've heard about that, and I've heard you speak to it. The thing I find interesting is I will say that when I would watch the show, my brother and I we would always make time to make sure we were home to watch it. But it triggered an interest on, hey, I got to buy comics now. It prompted an interest to learn more about the character in a different medium, just the comic books. And they were 12 cents then. But the other thing I kind of puzzled me, it always amazed me how confining, it was always Perry, Lois, Jimmy, Inspector Henderson. It was consistently as a child, right? When you see some of the clips that they spliced in, you think there's more background characters. You think it's really a city. Now when I watch some of these, I can see the stunt man, or I can see how they spliced in other footage, right?
Yeah.
And when I'm impressed, but I wasn't conscious of that when I was a child.
Listen, you want to talk about splicing in footage? I'll go back to Power Rangers. All the action footage in those shows comes from a Japanese series. And then when the kids are out of their costume, that's the American footage. And watching that as a little kid, I had no conception of that. Now I watch it and it's like, oh, but same type. And I promise, I'm not just saying this to plug the Power Rangers show. It's been a very valuable journey with both of these shows. Because same type of thing with Power Rangers, where I think it's easy to look at that show and again, see the seams, see the limitations. But my takeaway has just been, wow, what a challenge it must be to have to marry, original footage that you're creating with these American kids versus this Japanese action footage. And the way that they did it for a child in the 90s watching it, I loved it. And as an adult in 2023, I still love it.
Yeah. Yeah. And kudos to whoever had that eye and figured out how I can take two things and assemble them in a cohesive fashion, even though they might have been produced entirely differently.
Totally. And the reason I brought up the radio show, as I've said before, the radio show remains, for the most part, one of the last big remaining gaps in my Superman fandom. I've closed a lot over these past couple of years with these podcasts, but some remain. The radio show is still a big one. I've listened to some, but I've barely scratched the surface. And I just mentioned it because in a recent episode, when we talked about the episode Rescue, I had on Rob O'Connor from the All-Star Superfan podcast, and we were talking about, and this comes up actually in this episode that we're here to talk about, as well as another episode that you and I are going to talk about down the line, where Clark will either reference or actually have contact with someone he describes as, a good friend of mine. And as I'm watching Adventures of Superman, it's like, where are these people coming from? And Rob did point out, I think we were speaking about the stolen costume episode and the private investigator Candy. That was a character from the radio show, and you got a little bit more of the backstory. So, time permitting, I'm going to try to make a little bit of an effort, at least, to delve a little bit more into the radio show to see if there are instances where maybe it kind of fills in blanks. Not that it was necessarily intended to fit together into one continuity per se, but just that, maybe this show was pulling a little bit more from the radio show. And again, maybe some of these questions that I have might might be addressed.
That's fascinating. So in The Stolen Costume, Candy was a character in some episodes of the radio. And then I think we've discussed this a few times. That radio show helped create the foundation and the environment and the structure, right? I mean, Kryptonite was a device really created in the radio show that both comics and the TV show and movies all latched onto.
It's so funny because I look at Adventures of Superman as sort of, an unsung hero in the Superman mythology, something that doesn't always get its recognition, always get its due. But I don't know, the radio show might even have it beat. It's like you rarely hear that come up in the larger conversation, when it comes to Superman. But that show was pivotal. So maybe we'll spend a little more time with that too.
And to intrude for 30 seconds, I can remember when you and I did something probably over 2 years ago, and I listened to the very first ever episode of the radio show. I forget how I found it, right? But in that one, I remember calling you and saying, "Oh my God, in the radio show, he appears on, or he comes out of the spaceship, the rocket, fully grown wearing the costume." And you can tell even by the look at my face, that just floored me. And now they retrofitted it over time. But who, for all these things, I don't think the people working on them at the time said, you know what, this is going to last 70 or 75 or 80 years. They were probably pumping it out. We got to meet a deadline, or we need some content, or look, the sponsor's on us to do this. I was going to say, I think one thing that made it easy for me as a child watching the show was this was all filmed in syndication. This was not studio backed. So that might have greased the skids for a number of smaller TV stations all throughout the Midwest. Because I can remember, even in comic books, them listing like WGN, Channel 9 in Chicago, and a certain station in Kankakee, or a certain station in Gary, Indiana. Here's where you can get Superman on this station.
Gotcha. It's all fascinating. I wanted to spend this time talking about all of that with you, because I've heard from a number of listeners of this podcast who like yourself grew up watching it and are contemporaries of yourself, and I imagine that they probably enjoy hearing from one of their peers about that experience of watching it as a kid in that era.
We got to call Gene Cahill.
Gene Cahill is going to be on an upcoming episode.
Cool.
Yes, I haven't assigned him one yet, but he is going to be on the show. He's someone we know through the comic book store Fat Moose Comics in Whippany, New Jersey. Shout out to them; they're one of our sponsors. And he
cool.
is in the same group as yourself, and he will be on an episode coming up. So
cool.
Thank you for sharing that background about your experience with the show. And now let's get into No Holds Barred. I have to tell you, man, I had a great time watching this episode the first time around a couple of years ago. I had an even better time rewatching it now. I actually rewatched it twice this morning. So my wife and son and mother-in-law went on a trip to Disney World. We had all gone on one a few months ago, and they love it so much they wanted to go again. I was content to kind of hang back this time, but I had to drive them to the airport at 6:00 this morning. And so when I got back, I dropped them off. I stopped at a deli. I got a bacon, egg, and cheese on a roll, and I got a hot cup of coffee, and I came home, and I watched these 2 episodes. And then I went back to sleep for a couple of hours, and then I woke up, and I watched them again. And this episode and another one that you and I are going to talk about, for a later release. And I just had such a great time watching it. And, I want to talk a bit about our overall impressions of the episode, and then we'll do our more detailed scene-by-scene analysis. One of the first big picture things that I just want to say, because I don't want to forget this made me so happy. Guest star alert. So one of Clark's good friends, as we find out, is this wrestling promoter, Sam Bleeker, played by actor Dick Elliott. Now, from the first time I watched this episode, he jumped out at me. It's a Wonderful Life is one of my absolute all-time favorite movies. I watch it every Christmas. And Dick Elliott plays the man on the porch after George and Mary when they fell into the pool at the school dance and they're in the wet clothes. You've not seen the movie, have you? No.
I've never seen the movie.
Good Lord. Okay. It's all right. It's okay. Anyway.
Wrong answer, Rich.
George and Mary are having this romantic walk, and they're flirting, back and forth. But George isn't making his move yet. And there's this guy on a porch played by this actor, Dick Elliott. And he's getting frustrated by George's, lack of action here. And at one point he's like, why don't you kiss her instead of talking her to death? And that's the guy. And so I was so happy. I was so happy to see him. I love that.
Now I'll add to that. What's his name? Elliot?
Yeah, Dick Elliott.
Dick Elliott. And the guy that played the corrupt wrestling manager, Dick Elliott, and the corrupt manager are both characters in Mayberry RFD with Andy Griffith. I think Dick Elliott plays the mayor of Mayberry, and then the other fella is one of the townsmen. So they likewise appeared in that.
Yeah.
Small world.
I think the reason why I was so excited, I love It's a Wonderful Life so much, but also, look, this is an old show. I've said before, I'm a huge fan of The Honeymooners from the 50s. So it's not like I'm a total stranger to television of that era, but I'm not particularly well-versed outside of these couple of exceptions. So for the most part, when I come across a guest star in one of these episodes, I could look them up on IMDb, but it's not necessarily ringing any bells for me per se.
Here it did.
Here it really did. So I was very happy to see him. Let me toss it to you. Just as far as just overall big picture impressions of this episode, what stood out to you, and how, if at all, has your impression of this episode changed over the years?
Okay. And
if it has, and maybe it hasn't.
No, Anthony, I don't ever remember seeing this as a child. I don't remember seeing it. Truthfully, perhaps the first time I remember watching it was 2 years ago when we did our kind of macro level review. I enjoyed this. I learned, because I listened to a couple of your previous things. I didn't know this until last weekend, that at the end you asked for a criteria rating.
Yes.
And I really got to think about that. Because I think we'll agree, and I want to dig into this in its own unique occurrences. But geez, there were a lot of phenomenal episodes in season one. A lot of things, like you might have hit it already, The Mind Machine, or Superman on Earth, or The Night of Terror, or Crime Wave. The Stolen Costume. There's a lot in season one that is extremely good. Now, there's also Moose Island. So,
listen, I really I came around on The Haunted Lighthouse in a big way. I really did. I forget exactly what my final rating was. It wasn't the highest that I've given, but I can, if nothing else, now after rewatching and having that discussion for episode 2, I understand why there is love for that episode. And I did hear from a lot of people who enjoy that one a lot. So, there's an audience for it. And I don't know if I'm totally in that camp yet, but I definitely understand the episode and I appreciate it a lot more now than I did before. The other big picture takeaway for me, and I was kind of surprised by this when I was doing my rewatches this morning, was I love Perry White in this episode. For me, Perry was the star of this episode. And I know it's not necessarily a heavy Perry-centric episode, but the reason why I say this is I've been maybe a little bit hard on the John Hamilton iteration of Perry White, defined mostly by that gruffness, right, and the barking orders. And there's an entertainment value in that, but I've come to gravitate more towards, for example, the Lane Smith portrayal in Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, where, yes, there's gruffness, but there's also this softer, more paternal side to the character. So I like a little bit more of that balance. And you don't really get so much of that on Adventures of Superman. It really leans more into that, into
Curmudgeon.
the gruff curmudgeonly bulldog. However, in this episode, I just feel like we got a lot of different flavors of Perry. Yes, he's irritable when Clark realizes that Perry has forgotten the time that they're supposed to be watching the fight.
Hope those papers weren't important.
Yeah, and Clark is kind of teasing him about it, and Perry realizes, he's like, "Great Caesar's ghost," and he's so annoyed.
And he throws the paper, he crumples them up and throws them across the room.
Exactly. So you definitely see that, but you also see, right at the jump, we'll go through all the scenes and everything, but when he says, he's going to put a stop to this wrestler and this paralyzing hold, if it's the last thing he does, there's this determination, there's this quest for justice. There's also a more tender side that you see from Perry in a couple of instances. One is where he's put off by the crowds.
Yeah, they want blood. I don't like the sound of the crowd.
Yeah.
I'm gonna turn it down.
And he turns down the volume. And that really, I was surprised, especially from this version of Perry, but I thought it was, it gave a little bit of insight into a little bit more of who he is.
And then I know it's an important part of this. There's kind of a paternal, in a very altruistic way. He's paternal towards Lois and Clark and Jimmy. And there is a scene later on when he kind of pulls Clark off on the side and he goes, "Hey, Kent, you're not supporting this just because of your feelings for Lois." And that surprised me. I mean, it was more sensitive, I never credited Perry for kind of being that sensitive.
Absolutely. And look, I've talked about how, I wish that, I love the chemistry between Phyllis Coates and George Reeves. And I wish, I love any time there's some banter between Clark and Lois. I wish that this show had space for any exploration of a romance. And I know that wasn't the case, but, you at least get a hint of it in this episode, with Clark's potential jealousy over Lois spending time with Wayne. And the fact that Perry clocks that, and like you said, brings it up to Clark, but does it again, he's not barking at Clark. He's really taking a moment to interact with him on a human level. This is not, I know there are other episodes where Perry White's Big Scoop or things like that, where, you would look at it as more of a Perry episode. I wouldn't put this in that category, but I just felt like the character was more dynamic and layered here, and you got to see more shades than we typically get.
Yeah. And I think even when Perry asked Clark about it, he kind of said something like, hey, Clark, I think I know you well enough to ask this.
Yeah, exactly.
And it wasn't accusatory.
Right.
It was more concern. I mean, just altruistic caring. But just the way he entered into it, it wasn't like, hey, I need, accusatory. I think I know you well enough to ask this. So he was looking out for both Lois's best interest and Clark's well-being.
So this episode revolves around wrestling, not the modern wrestling that we might think of today, right? Where there are storylines and it's choreographed and all of that. And you have these outsized personalities and everything. This is really the sport of wrestling, right? And we open with what I'm assuming is footage from actual wrestling matches or stock footage from a movie or something like that. Did you have any sense? I mean, that I assume like those opening shots were not something that were created for the show. It seems like they were repurposed.
I agree. I truly believe they were repurposed. Truly. My memory is, now I do remember back in the early 60s when once a year we would leave Chicago and come to my mother's parents who lived in Philadelphia. And I even think times when I was in high school, they did have wrestling shows on local stations here or in Philadelphia. And it was akin to what was portrayed in this episode. I think these are repurposed film, because as we noticed in this episode, when Bad Luck Brannigan is wrestling someone, or when Wayne Winchester gets on the mat, there's no one in the background, right?
Right. But yeah, I mean, I like the setup. It sounds so silly because again, I watched this not that long ago when we did those other episodes 2 years ago. But in my mind, even though rationally, if you asked me to describe this episode, I think the wrestling aspect would have come to mind for whatever reason in my mind. I kept thinking of this as boxing, and obviously it's not. But I went into this. My wires got crossed, I guess, and I went into this episode. But hey, the boxing episode. Saw the wrestling. I was like, oh, okay, right on. No, I thought it was it was a cool setup for the episode. So you see again this repurposed film, right, of wrestling matches with the headlines, right, teeing up our story here. The fact that this wrestler, Bad Luck Brannigan, fights for a guy named Murray, is using this so-called paralyzer hold and putting his opponents in the hospital. 7 men in the hospital. This is dangerous business here.
Yes.
So we go to the Daily Planet, and Clark enters the office, and he and Perry are talking about this. And this is where, that the scene that I just was describing a moment ago, where Perry is determined to put a stop to this.
And in that same breath, later in this first season, I forget what episode it is, but there's a reference to Perry being the former mayor of Metropolis.
That's in the Crime Wave episode.
Oh, okay.
Where we get, and that's via... So that's at the end of the season. I'm excited to get to that one. And that's the episode, famously that used recycled footage from from the first season.
And kudos to them. They spliced it together. So it was well done. I didn't remember, but I do remember that reference for one of the things like former mayor of Metropolis. So that kind of gives a little more impetus to his, I'm going to put a stop to this now. This is corrupt. People are being crippled and put in, I'm going to put a stop to it. And there's such passion and such determination.
We talked about that line, and I tell you, man, I have never forgotten that line. It was like a throwaway line in that narration, in that Crime Wave episode. And to my knowledge, I don't know, and audience, if you know, tell me, I'm not aware of any other instance in any other medium where Perry White's past as the mayor of Metropolis is ever part of his backstory. I could be totally wrong, but I've gone through a lot now at this point. It seems like this was an isolated instance, but it's...
There's more, there's probably more in the radio show.
Okay.
Because I remember reading some stuff about the radio show where I think there was a substitute editor that came into the Daily Planet because there was like a campaign to get Perry White to be the vice president running mate. So clearly he had some sort of either political background, prior history, or interests in politics, but they wanted him to be the vice presidential candidate, right?
Oh, fascinating. Okay. Again, the radio show, it warrants further exploration, but I always kept that in mind, and it does, to your point, you're totally right. It does help to account for, not that it would have been like wildly out of character for him to want to put a stop to this, but it seemed to go beyond, hey, we report on the news. It was kind of another level here. And so, yes, if you factor in, well, he used to run the city, it totally tracks. So I love that. What the funniest thing to me about this scene is, Perry tells Clark he wants to bring in Wayne Winchester, this college wrestling champ, right? He was the champ the prior year, to study Brannigan and try to get a sense of how he's doing this to his opponents. So, well, actually, 2 things that made me laugh. Number one, we'll meet Wayne Winchester in a subsequent scene, and he was played by actor Malcolm Mealy. He's supposed to be this champ 1 year out of college. I did the math. He was born in 1920, so he was 31 when they filmed this in 1951, so a decade older than he should have been. And I feel like he looked like 40. I mean, he looked like so much older than you would expect for a college wrestling champ, right?
Absolutely.
I loved him in the part, but it was just like, he's supposed to be like this young kid.
Yes. He looked like he was 38 years old, right? And had a few years on him, right? That being said, I checked IMDb. He's only got 4 credits in his entire acting career. He did 2 episodes of Adventures of Superman. He did something called Our Little Margie, which was another half-hour sitcom, I guess. And then he was an uncredited actor in some 1952 feature film. That's it. That's it. Now, I tried to get some background. Either he was a former football player or a former weightlifter, and that's why they pulled him into this. And I'll say this fast, then we'll move. I want to get into the nuts and bolts. But he's in this episode, and he's in the episode that's broadcast immediately next, the haunted, the deserted village or something like that.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll be recording that one next. So I'll definitely keep an eye out. I haven't done my rewatch of that yet, but that made me laugh. But the other thing about this scene, I got to get your take on this is, Perry has this idea, bring in Wayne Winchester, wrestling expert. He can tell us what's going on. Clark offers, hey, my friend, Sam Bleeker, the promoter, I can ask him for some insight.
And Perry kind of dismisses it.
He just shuts him down. He's like, no, we need an expert. It's like, hey, buddy, how about maybe you pursue both avenues?
Yeah, what's the downside?
It doesn't have to be one or the other. And of course, Clark will eventually encounter Sam a little bit later. But it was just, I don't know. It just made me laugh that he was just so dismissive of that notion.
Yeah, I agree. But then Clark pursued that avenue.
Yeah.
And
well, listen, Clark's going to do what Clark's going to do.
Right.
But
It
was just, it just made me laugh.
What I liked, if I may, two things I found very interesting, because Clark did do exactly what he said he was going to do. He reaches out to Sam. And Anthony, this harkens back to stuff you appreciated a lot on The Honeymooners, right? So when Clark is outside the building that Murray operates out of, he's standing, kind of near the front door, and the bricks are behind him, and Sam comes walking up, and Clark goes, hey, Sam, yeah, doing well. But they as professionals, they just kept moving along, Clark goes, hello, Sam, doing well, So he picked up, and they kept the conversation going. The other thing I liked about that scene, that I think this, and I'm going to come to this later, I think this episode was produced much earlier than it was aired, because they started giving the super hearing, that's the first time I ever remember, his trying to listen through the walls. So they portrayed super hearing. And there's another scene much later in here that leads me to believe that this was originally envisioned to be one of the earlier episodes to be aired, but it didn't occur that way. It was produced, I think, and it was produced with the intention of being aired earlier, but that didn't occur.
Yeah, I can check to see which batch of episodes this was in. I don't know offhand, but I wouldn't be surprised. Are you referring to? I think it's at the end after the big rescue where Perry says Superman again. Yeah.
Like he's such a new phenomenon. They don't have a handle on him, right?
Exactly.
And even the way he said it, it was like, what, him again? So yeah, the novelty of Superman, it hadn't been embedded. Now, I'm sorry to jump all over the place, but we saw at the end of Superman on Earth, he kind of caught the guy, and he got a lot of headlines. So Perry, you should have been reading your own paper.
Yeah, I know. Though I can get past, right? It's a different time. You're not bombarded with the news in every form the way we are now. So I don't know. I can buy it a little bit. But prior to that scene where Clark meets Sam, and you're right, that flubbed line was hilarious. That very funny exchange. But you're right. It did call to mind The Honeymooners. It's like you muscle through and you keep going. And, there's something kind of charming about it. And it's like, sometimes we misspeak, or sometimes we, in real life, like you miss a cue or something like that, or you assume that someone's going to say, hey, how's it going? Because that's typically what people say. And so
doing well.
You just like have that automatic response. It adds, it adds a little texture. I like that. I think that's cool. Prior to that scene, though, we have the Daily Planet crew, Lois, Clark, Perry, Jimmy, and Wayne, in the Daily Planet offices watching the fight. And Perry's got jokes in this scene because, Clark spends the whole fight trying to see Brannigan's hands, his fingers. And when
does he have a nice manicure?
Yeah, it's like this, again, just like a lot of different flavors of Perry in this episode. And, Wayne's on the case, and Perry tasks Clark with helping Wayne with this investigation. So we're kind of off and running here. And then, of course, we have the scene that you just described where Clark is talking to Sam. And, between Sam's conversation with Clark and then the conversation between Sam and the crooked manager, Murray, you get a sense about, kind of the state of the wrestling game at the moment and how, kind of dire it is and how, Murray is really the one with the control with this fighter who can.
And you're going to give me 60%?
Yeah. So I think you get a little bit of an insight into the stakes beyond, of course, the most important, human element of these people being hurt and seriously injured. So, like you said, we get the tickets that Sam gives to Clark for the fight, and this then leads us to this exchange between Clark and Perry in the office and Wayne, where Wayne's what?
Well, why don't you tell, if I may, earlier? No, I know where you're going. I want to let you finish your idea, please.
Oh no, just where Wayne says, "Say, maybe Miss Lane would like to go with me," and Clark groans. It's an audible response from him. It's again one of the few instances, certainly early on at least, where you get any real indication that there's something going on or that he would want something to be. It's such a great moment.
Yeah. I mean, no. So I was gonna let you pick it up where the next match occurs, and I was just so surprised as a child when Wayne jumps into the ring after Bad Luck basically says, "I'm the best wrestler in the world. There's not. I'll even write. I'll wrestle gorillas if they can get him in the ring with me." And then Wayne takes him down, right? Now, what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, Wayne displays a bit of recklessness, but a lot of courage, I think, and heroism throughout this episode. It's one thing as we
Pretty
follow
impulsive.
a bit impulsive. Well, he's trying to impress Lois here, but it's like as much as we follow Superman on all of his exploits, but he has this added level of protection, of vulnerability. So to see someone else where the stakes are a lot higher, I definitely think it's compelling. You root for him.
Yes.
But before we get to that scene where he jumps into the ring and accepts the challenge, we get sort of the behind the scenes at Murray's camp about what's actually going on. Where we meet,
I'd forgotten about that. I forgot.
So
I know what you mean
we
now.
meet Ram, the so-called Swami. I looked up the term Swami, this comes up from time to time, right? We're watching a show that's 70 years old. Not everything, would play through a modern lens, and I think that in this show, when we see depictions of other ethnicities in particular, they are portrayed in a way where we typically would not see it portrayed that way today. They're typically portrayed by a white actor in makeup, and accents and characterizations are very stereotypical. And so I think that this character here falls into that. Even the term Swami, and again, I don't say any of this. It's not like, hey, let's come in and take the show apart. It was a different era, but I just always trying to understand and place everything in its context. Even the term Swami, it means a teacher, like a Hindu teacher. I don't know that term is necessarily still in play or would be used in the way that it is here. I don't know. But certainly the characterization and the casting for this character, I don't think you would see unfold the same way. But what this scene gives us, right, is this character Ram, this Indian immigrant who perhaps they just outright abducted, right? And they're keeping him captive here. There's this scene between Ram and Murray where Murray makes it seem like, hey, we're protecting you. Like the government's out to get you.
Yeah, or the government police. The government police, we're going to get you.
Yeah.
I'm protecting you. Now, I embedded or I read into that Murray has just manipulated this guy so much because they never gave any reason as to why Ram should be so terrified of authorities or police. And I just described to that Murray is deceiving him and manipulating him and keeping him in thrall so he can use his knowledge to help Bad Luck and the other wrestlers So this corrupt syndicate's always on top.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and that's the thing. We don't get the backstory. We don't know if, this Ram came to the United States and they grabbed him, right? And they said, hey, they're after you. Or if, I mean, we don't know
We don't
how,
know.
we don't know how
We
this
don't
came
know.
to be, but, you definitely get the sense that, yes, they are, sort of perpetuating this
Manipulating,
notion,
yeah.
right, that he's in danger and they're the only ones that can protect him. And they're using his knowledge of pressure points, right, to teach the wrestlers, Brannigan in particular. And, Brannigan now is going to go up against Adonis, right, this top wrestler who has the spinner move,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so Ram shows him how he would be able to apply pressure to the other wrestler's leg to disable him. But what I liked in the scene between Ram and Murray was, you get to see Ram push back. I mean, to the show's credit, they do give the Ram character some agency here and a moral code of his own, right? Like he brings up this idea, like, hey, if you're using, and he gets tough with
Oh,
Murray
yeah,
there,
yeah,
where
yeah.
he's like, hey, if you're using this to hurt people, like
It would not be healthy for you.
yeah, yeah. So I like that. I mean, I think it would have been easy to make this character more, more passive. I mean,
Acquiescent.
I mean, he's being used, but he has these instances where he,
He asserts
is
himself.
trying to overcome. And I really appreciated that. I thought that was a nice little touch.
I agree. And then in that very scene when Ram does assert himself and I think he does something like, look, master, if you are using my techniques to harm others, it would not be good. And he kind of physically moves towards Murray, and Murray kind of calls the other guys in, Crusher and Brannigan. He calls them in. And then he says, hey, help him back to his room and make sure you keep the doors locked and all that. And I watched this a few days ago and I don't remember it, but I think there's one point when Bad Luck Brannigan really reminded me of the guy from The Birthday Letter, right? He's got this silly, goofy look on his face where he just can't comprehend Murray's going like, yeah, we'll take care of him. What is that? So I saw the flashback to, was it John Doucette or something like that? From
the slugger character.
Yes. Kind of the dim-witted gangster.
For sure. So from there, we go to the scene that we already talked about where Brannigan wins again, issues this challenge. If anyone wants to take me on, Wayne, very brash, jumps into the ring, accepts the challenge, and knocks Brannigan down.
I'll take you one week from tonight. Best 2 out of 3.
No holds barred. So we get the title of the episode invoked there. And then we have one of my favorite scenes, funny, I mean, unintentionally funny to me, where we're back in the Daily Planet offices and, Perry and Lois, they're trying to talk Wayne out of this. This is a terrible idea. Like all of these people have been paralyzed. They're in the hospital. And Perry goes, Clark, why don't you say something? Clark,
I think the boy can do it. Yeah. I think the boy can do it, Perry.
It's amazing. I love, I love this scene because of course Clark's our hero here. And we know he's trying to piece this together. He knows. And Wayne, right. As a wrestler, he too, like they both have this notion that there's some trick that can be learned and exposed and overcome. Right. So they know that there is a way. But there is also this like we know that it's Clark of course doesn't want anything to happen to Wayne, but there is kind of this undercurrent. We had that groan when Wayne mentioned taking Lois to the fight, and so it just kind of all tracks when we get to the point of Perry asking him that question that we talked about before, like, hey, like does this have something to do with the friendship between Wayne and Lois, and
even Clark retorts back going, hey, Perry, please, there's no green-eyed monster here. Don't worry. And I think even prior to that, Clark says something like, I actually think the boy can do it.
Right. But in the context of the scene, their reactions are valid and plausible because it really seems like, hey, what are you setting this kid up for?
Yeah. And also, Brannigan's got a pretty consistent track record, right?
Yeah. Well, it's like you haven't heard this one, but like we just talked about the mind machine, and it was crazy to me in that episode where you have multiple, it's like a handful of witnesses whose brains are damaged and they're killed, right, as a result of them trying to give their testimony. And Lois is like, well, I got to go, I got to do my part. I got to move forward with my testimony. And the senator who's running these hearings, he's like, look, we got a schedule to keep. It's like every witness is dead. Like, how can you move forward with this?
And geez, Anthony, I haven't watched that. I haven't watched that in over 2 years. I will say, here's what cracked me up. Now, and we saw probably the most vehement Lois we've ever seen, where she basically goes after Clark supports it. And if I may, before I get to the Lois thing, this is what I loved most about Superman. I mean, or Clark's portrayal. He is very supportive of people. He's confident. And I don't think he would, if he thought Wayne was going to get obliterated, I don't think he would have supported it. But he had confidence in Wayne.
Right.
But you saw a very harsh, vehement side of Lois going, I never want to see you again, right? Until the first 2 minutes of the next episode when she goes, hey, my teacher's not around, want to drive me out.
I know. It's one of those things, I think, for this first season in particular, you just got to look at each one in a vacuum. But your point is well taken. I know, it's easy to say, oh, why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do that? I would have appreciated any kind of one-on-one scene between Lois and Wayne, right? Because it becomes clear, like, she seems to have, I mean, at a bare minimum on a human level, right? She's concerned for his safety, but I don't know.
Was she attracted?
Is there maybe something a little bit more, right? It would have been nice to have even just, a couple of moments between them where you got any kind of sense of, whether or not this was something that had a little bit more behind it.
Yeah.
Again, I understand why, I'm not, it would have been surprising to me if they did that. I'm just saying, like, I wish, like, that's one of those things where it's like, oh, I wish like a scene between just the two of them.
It's something they would have done today.
Oh, for sure.
But then this might be more of the audience they were targeting. The fact that these were done in one, like 23-minute, something like that, right? So, and they were also, all the people involved were really originated in the 1930s Republic B serials, where it's action, right? You pump it out. You almost portray it so fast people don't pick them on plot holes.
That's fair. That's fair. Well, maybe we're going to walk into a potential plot hole in an upcoming scene here. I want to get your take on this. But the last thing I want to say about that scene, just putting my lawyer hat on, when Perry says, it's like, all right, Clark, like, if you think Wayne can do this, then this is on you. You have to accept, if anything happens to him, this is on you. And Clark agrees to that. It's like, listen, as your attorney, you don't agree to that. But so at this point, we get another instance of super hearing, right, where Clark overhears Brannigan and Murray talking about, making sure that the chain on Ram's door is latched and everything. And so Clark changes into Superman. And this is one of those rare instances where, we've talked a lot about the different kinds of takeoffs for Superman. And we get to a certain point in the show. And to your point, this probably was one of the earlier ones, because we get to the point in the show where Superman takes off, right? He jumps on that springboard.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. But this was an instance where a stuntman, presumably, although I know there were instances where it was Reeves until he was injured, where he was lifted on wires.
Yes.
But that's what it looks like in that alley there when he's taking off. It didn't look like the standard springboard, I believe. But anyway, we get to the scene where Superman bends the bars, right, to Ram's room, and he comes in and he sits down, cross-legged, and Ram presumes that he's a genie, right, or some sort of magical mystical being. Before I editorialize, what was your read on Superman's approach, his demeanor, his behavior in this interaction between the two of them when they're sitting across from each other?
Yeah, I had two thoughts on that. One, I thought it was a sign of Superman's respect for Ram, that basically he matched the very posture and seating that Ram had. I thought that's like, I'm respectful enough that I'm going to match exactly you on your terms. I did think that Superman talked down to him. His language, I will explain these things to you, right? So I thought that was a little, I don't think he meant it to be condescending, but looking at it through today's lens, he wasn't, he didn't elevate him up and talk to him in a common, but I thought the seating from a physical body language posture was a sign of respect. I thought that the language and the choice of words and the way they were conveyed was not appropriate.
I agree totally with both. I don't really have much more to add other than like that was kind of what struck me with this, where it did feel like he was patronizing and almost belittling in the way that he was talking. I mean,
You must tell me these techniques.
yeah, I mean, he's very calm, right, and sort of gentle and patient with him, but it was more akin to how he would behave towards a child, I felt. And even just the fact that, when he says, you must be a genie, it's like, I don't know. Maybe Superman's like, listen, I'm pressed for time. Let me just go along with this. I'll tell this guy I'm a genie. But it's like, well, you could say who you actually are.
Yeah. But I now that we're discussing this spontaneously, could that have been more like, does it amplify the meaning to children? Like, oh, he's like a genie. He's got powers. I don't know.
Yeah. Not to be cynical, I suspect, again, if this were not the Swami character, I don't think the behavior would have been the same. I think this probably stems from, the person who's being depicted here, I think, but
And
hard to
Anthony,
say for sure.
you've said this a few times. There are some things now that you look or watch and you just kind of cringe. Like I thought I don't know what season it was, 1 or 2, that episode where My Friend Superman, right? It pandered just to caricatures.
Right.
And, that's the downside to these things. But again, I think this was the 1938 Republic B serial. Just punch it out, right? Go speed for speed's sake.
Whenever I bring up stuff like this, and I think the audience, certainly knows what my intention is. I hope that they do, right? It's never to pick it apart. I mean, because it's fine. There are a ton of rewatch podcasts out there. A lot of them are hosted by people who were on the show that they're talking about. And, sometimes it can be a little grating when they're sort of tearing it down, right? Because it might not live up to, the standard of today necessarily. Again, I think conversations are worth having. It's not meant to say it's, whatever. Like, it is what it is. It's a product of its time. It's just something that, especially watching it now, it definitely jumps out. It's fun. It's funny though, because The Office, which is a show that I know, you're a big fan of as well. It continues to be watched. Like it's, had been on Netflix for a long time and just caught this second wave and so popular. But that comes up in conversation a lot, where it's like, oh, like that would never fly today. Like, certain things are, not politically correct or whatever term you want to put on it. And I always bristle against that a little bit, because it's like I don't feel like the show is ever glorifying any of the inappropriate behavior, right? Like that was the whole premise of it, was like, this is not appropriate. Like that was baked into it. Anyway, I digress. But
Well,
yeah.
I'll say this fast. And I didn't think about it literally till this second. You're talking about other shows. This is our first ever Supernatural Smallville crossover, because we've got Winchester and we've got Superman.
That's right. That Winchester name did jump out at me. Oh, this is what I was going to say. Maybe I'm nitpicking here. Maybe it's not a plot hole per se. At this point in the episode, Superman now knows there's this guy being held captive behind bars and a chain against his will.
I know.
Who's being made to teach.
Why didn't he shut it down right then and there?
These techniques, right, that are putting people in the hospital. Now, from a meta perspective, it's like, well, we have to get to the end of the episode. And clearly this episode is building towards a bout in the ring between Wayne and Brannigan. We have to get, like, structurally, we have to get there. But when you have this scene, it's just sort of like, well, why could you not
shut the whole
this
thing
down now?
Yeah. Hey, let me go over to the door. I'll rip the door off the hinges, break the chain, and I'll do 8 minutes in the future. In the episode.
Look, a counterpoint, I'll argue against myself. I mean, maybe it's this idea that, Superman wants to make a larger point. It's not about shutting it down behind the snes. It's about,
because if Wayne wins, that shows that, hey, if you play the game right, if you adhere to the rules, that's a better message.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're being a little generous, but I'm going to go with that. I think as far as what makes this episode make more internal logical sense, I think that works. I like that.
Listen, looking at it over 70 years later, it's probably the best answer we can come up with, right? Because I pondered that also, like, well, look, once you went in there and you bent the bars, why didn't you just go downstairs and kick the snot out of Murray and his goons, right?
Well, all right, I'm glad you mentioned that. This is the tragic part of this episode, because when Superman left, he fixed those bars. Poor Ram is sitting there. He's like, oh, that genie, he was so nice. I wish he would have taken me with him.
Yeah, I know. But I think it was more, if I may, I don't know. Like you said, the structure of the show. That's the way the script was written. It's got to improve, build, increase. Wayne wins the fight, then Superman goes back and cleans house. But yeah, even when I watched it, I thought, well, wait a minute. Why don't you just protect the guy, right? No, you got to stay here and keep teaching them techniques.
It's crazy. But from there, we go to this scene in Clark's apartment where Wayne shows up. And, this is where, Clark starts to tell him about the pressure points and essentially starts to train him, as it were. But, Rich, I gotta ask you a personal question. Like, when you get home from work.
I know. Do you put on a silk robe on top of your dress shirt and slacks? And the other thing I thought, wasn't it pretty hot? Because you got your Superman costume underneath.
That was such a curious choice. There are a lot of things where something comes up that I'm like, oh, that seems a little odd. I chalk it up to, hey, maybe it was sort of a convention of the day. But it's like, was that ever a thing? Like, you put your bathrobe on? Oh, and I don't mean to harp on this, but it just seemed like it's an odd choice. Like, was it the rule? Like, oh, when Clark's at home, he's got to be in his full suit, or he's got to be, but then he takes it off. So I don't understand.
But I don't have I don't have an answer for that. I don't have an answer for that, because he was in his apartment basically just with his slacks and his dress shirt, no tie, no jacket, right? I did a little bit of a pause when I saw him come out in that silk robe, right, on top of his business clothes. Okay. I don't know. Anthony, I'd have to look back, and maybe that was more the style of the 30s and the 40s and early 50s. I don't know.
Maybe. Audience, if whether you or a parent, if this was common, but please let me know. It just made me laugh. But again, we now get into this training thing, and then Jimmy shows up later, and they're working
there's our
together.
Jimmy.
Oh, good old Jimmy. He's getting tossed around in this episode. Poor Jim. We haven't talked about him. He's hanging around in this episode. The first time when they're watching the fight, he tries to put the paralyzer on himself. He lets out what a wail he lets out in that early scene. He gets thrown around here. For the rest of the episode, he's mostly giving Wayne rub downs. There's a lot of Jimmy giving everyone, actually, Clark too. Like, there's a lot of shoulder rubs.
Bare chested Wayne.
Yeah. Hey man, listen, it's all good. Yet,
and I gotta say, where you're going, Wayne built up those defenses pretty quickly. He had like 6 days, right?
Listen, a few shoulder rubs is all you need.
Yeah, I guess Kryptonian shoulder rubs really build up your tolerance to these things.
I guess too, once you know what it feels like, when someone's, attempting to do it, and you can maybe maneuver out of it. I'll go along with that. When I think of pressure points, what my quote unquote introduction to that was? I think it was Xena Warrior Princess. I don't know if you ever watched the show, but there was this thing like where she would do these pressure points like on people's neck, and they wouldn't be able to breathe, and then she would release it.
Really?
Yeah.
So like Mr. Spock in some ways.
Oh, okay.
From the early the 1960s original series.
I'm not a Star Trek guy, but
Okay.
I guess. But that's what I always think of when I think of pressure points. But anyway, so we have this whole training bit, and the other thing I just wanted to mention here, because I think this offers a measure of redemption and and relief in this episode, is where this whole business about these pressure points can be relieved. So all of these fighters who have been paralyzed, it's not necessarily a life sentence here, right?
And
And Ram explains that at Murray's camp about how
yes,
this can be alleviated.
and it's also reiterated at the very, very end. But at that point in time, when Clark is training Wayne, giving him, like you said, giving him a sense of this is what's going to happen, right? So he starts preparing himself, like you said so well. He gets a feeling for here's how it feels, both mentally and from his physiological standpoint. At the same time, we got Ram showing how they can undo some of the stuff on a tactical level, which gives kind of hope. Like, you know what, those 7 guys, we can probably do something for them, right? But at one point, I think they said those 7 guys were in comas. So,
Oh, I didn't remember that part, but well, I'm sure it all worked out for them. There's yet another Perry moment, a quiet moment before the big fight where Perry and Lois are in the office talking about their concerns. And again, just more flavors of Perry White where he's like, Clark's usually right.
yeah, I
And
have
Lois
that.
is like, well, he can't be, it's only human to be wrong at some point. And Perry says, like, sometimes I wonder if he even is human.
Yeah, yeah. And I picked up on that too. And not both sentences, but the first sentence. Kent's usually right about this, right? And wow, way to go, Perry. You might in the moment be angry at someone, but he did step back. He goes, Kent's usually right about this. So I enjoyed hearing that, even though it was kind of a quick one sentence.
Yeah. Every time you touch that, I'm getting a little bit of, I'm hearing it. Do you need to adjust it, the microphone?
Is that okay?
Yeah. That's fine. Stop touching it. This is our first in-studio guest, audience. This is very exciting. This is the best audio quality we've had yet. I've been very pleased with the results we've been able to achieve through all of our virtual recordings, and hopefully the audience has agrees and has enjoyed and has been able to hear everything clearly. But it's never the same as when you can have 2 people in the same room on the same types of microphones.
And it's
together.
also, if I may, so enjoyable just to bounce off our body, our reactions, our the eyes, the gestures, and even the tone of voice. It's more impactful across the room.
I only wish, we have the video component. We should have dressed the part. We should have thrown on a couple of bathrobes over our regular clothes. But yeah, that scene again. Not to rehash, but just with Perry, you see he runs the gamut in this episode. You get the irritable curmudgeon. You get the more sensitive side. You get the paternal side. You get this unknowingly insightful side of like he might not even be human. It's like, yup, it's right under your nose, buddy. I love the way Perry is portrayed here. So now to our wrestling bout here. Wayne wins. He's able to withstand the paralyzer hold and is able to win. Backstage in the dressing room, more rub downs and all that. And I wanted to talk to you about this because Clark, once again, uses his super hearing. He knows that Murray's going to go and take care of Ram. But before Clark can leave, old Sam enters.
I was also, what I thought was interesting was when Murray criticizes Brannigan. He goes, look, I don't know what's going on. I kept using that hold and this kid keeps grinning at me, right? And even it was the longest sit down on the mat. Finally, Sam blocks him and pushes him off. I'm getting all my names goofed up. Wayne pushes him off. But I thought now we're right up where you were referencing, where they're back in the dressing room. Sam goes, I got my next star candidate. And I think earlier in the show, Murray kind of said something like, look, I want to shut this down fast because Sam's going to start bringing these college boy wrestlers, and these guys really know how to wrestle. So he really wanted to obliterate Winchester. Sorry, a couple of things that I should have said 2 or 3 minutes earlier.
No, it's all good. But it's just what made me laugh and what made me think of you is Sam unknowingly gets in Clark's way right? He wants to sign Wayne, right? And assumes that Clark is his manager and that he has to go through Clark, right, to make a deal with Wayne. And Clark's trying to get out of there. He's got to save Ram.
He's got to save Ram.
And of course, this calls to mind the Night of Terror episode that you and I have laughed about many
Miss
times. Right?
Backrack.
When Miss Backrack is just slowing him down, and he gets so impatient. I was floored. I could not. When I watched this for the first time this morning, first time in 2 years, I didn't remember, and I assumed, I was like, oh, I'm sure he just impatiently like blows past Sam. I couldn't believe that he actually stayed and talked. He was like,
Gabbed.
well, why don't you talk to Jimmy?
Yes. Why don't you guys work it out?
Yeah.
And then they leave the room, and off come the glasses, and yeah.
Although maybe this speaks to his feelings, right? Like in Night of Terror, Lois was in danger. He had, he wasn't going to waste a second. Not that he doesn't care about Ram, but maybe it's not quite the same level of urgency.
Maybe Ram can get knocked around a little bit for a few minutes.
And Ram, you talk about, again, the sort of the grittiness of the first season. They're holding, when we get to Murray's gym.
Before you do that, what I love, did you see all those gorillas? The guy with the top hat and the caricatures running towards the car, right? And they all pile in this car. And these guys like their beef. I mean, those other wrestlers were not svelte. But if you notice, when the car pulls into the alleyway, they never put it in park.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I know.
It just cracked me up. They all pile out of it, and then it just starts rolling back.
But again, going back to kind of the violence of the first season, when we're there in the gym, they're holding Ram's arms behind his back, twisting it, slapping him around. It's not, to be honest, it's not the most violent thing we've seen. The Monkey Mystery episode opens with a whipping scene. So
I haven't seen that. I even 2 years ago, I didn't watch the Monkey.
It's a great Dan Greenfield and I, we talked about that one. I know I just mentioned a very grim scene, but most of the rest of the episode is not like that. And we had a lot of fun and a lot more laughs than I expected we would have talking about that episode. But anyway, so yeah, he's kind of in dire straits before Superman shows up. But I want to jump back just for a second to Perry and Lois, right? Like after the fight and Clark hasn't shown up yet and Perry's trying to get a hold of him. This is where I don't know what to make of this because
I think we're going to say the same thing. Where is Kent, And then Perry kind of goes to Lois. If I know anything, he's going to go over there and he's going to tear that information, or he's going to tear it out of Murray. And I was wondering, where did this come from? Because he did say something like that. If Kent's not I bet he's going over to Murray's and he's going to rip that information out of him. And that really surprised me.
That's the thing. And it's a little, especially when you look at the totality of the first season, and I'll continue tracking this as we get into the second, it is a little tough to reconcile because like we've said, and we've used the same words, and I quote these words a lot in these episodes, again, how the Reeves Clark is very confident, very authoritative, right? Very assertive. And you see that a lot. And here is an instance of Perry recognizing that, right? Yet there are other instances, and I talked about this when we did the Mind Machine episode and the whole bus rescue sequence where, again, I don't need to rehash the whole thing, but Clark needs to get away to change into Superman. So he says to Lois, like, oh, she wants to go after the bus. And he's like, oh, well, what about that lady who's in that car back there? And, she reads that as like, oh, like you're scared, to come with me. So it's like, okay, fine, go help the lady. So like there are instances like that where he displays what might be reasonably seen as cowardice. But then you have something like this where they have this perception of him as this badass who's just going out to knock some heads. So yeah, it's a little tough to reconcile all of that. But at the end of the day, I think where maybe it breaks down a little bit is in terms of like what people's views of him are. Sometimes I think that's where it gets a little. It doesn't always totally track, but in terms of his behavior and what we like, what we gravitate towards in this version of the character, I think that's a clear through line. And then we get the big Superman action sequence. Go for it.
No, I was going to say, I think this is the high point of this episode. So Ram is being tortured, and you're right. The way they portrayed it, you've got like these 6 or 7 bruisers, gorillas, and they're twisting his arms behind his back and they're slapping him around. I just loved that one thing when Reeves comes through the room or the door, vaults over the railing, or says something like, "Hey boys, the party's over." And that was so well choreographed, right? And when I watched it this time, now I could see very clearly when the stuntman, but they spliced it so well that there wasn't a pause. I mean, it was very fluid, very tight. And this is, I think I said 2 years ago, Reeves used to box. His mother made him quit boxing. I think he got his nose broken like 8 times. But you could see very well in this when he takes Murray and he clocks him, and his positioning, his athleticism was well portrayed. So, and you referenced this like a minute ago. I really think this action sequence, I think there's 3 fantastic action sequences in the whole first season. The bus with the mind machine was very action oriented, very exciting. And my God, what they did so well with a shoestring budget was fantastic. Same thing here. It's choreographed, I think, extremely well. The way he jumps over that railing and just gets into the thick of it. And, hey, he's not a kinder, gentler, sensitive guy. And then later on in Crime Wave, when they splice so many things together.
Yes. Yeah. No, I agree with all of that. I love this fight sequence. I love when one of the bad guys throws the barbell at him and he just tosses it off right back. And I thought that was great. Yeah, the stuntman is obvious. We've seen this now in a bunch of episodes. I'm noticing it. You know what? It's funny because when I did that binge a couple of years ago, it was a binge. I mean, I watched those first 2 seasons in a pretty compressed period of time. I mean, a few weeks maybe. So, for 52 episodes, it was a lot. And so I'm sure there were a lot of details that I missed or things that blurred together or things that I just outright forgot. Because the obviousness of the stuntmen in a lot of these scenes, I mean, I noticed some of them the first time around, but I like, as I'm doing my rewatch for this podcast, and there are a lot of times like, oh man, like that is so apparent.
Right. When I watched it 2 years ago, there was one scene when I was conscious that it was a stuntman. When I rewatched it last Sunday, I was more conscious of the stuntman. But I compliment, boy, how they edited that and made it real crisp was well done. I was going to say, the thing that surprised me, in the majority of the other episodes, there's only one bad guy. Or like you said, in the Mind Machine, there were 3 that he fights. This is one where they they used that wrestling room, and it was really a brawl.
Look, we say this in a lot of these episodes as we're talking about season 1, that this was a Superman who engaged in fisticuffs. And it's so viscerally thrilling to watch. Now, I don't know, how do you account for this? Do you before you said that you look at this as the Golden Age Superman. The Golden Age Superman didn't have the full power set and power levels that the later incarnations of Superman would. Do you look at this Superman in the Reeves show as just a depowered enough version that he can punch someone and not kill them? Or do you assume, well, he's pulling his punches as he's doing this?
The former. In my perception, it's more akin to the Golden Age, where he can punch him and not, obviously he's got super strength, but he doesn't have the super strength of the Silver Age, where he can juggle planets or, move the moon. So I didn't see him holding back. Again, I thought both the bus episode and this were probably the best action-oriented sequences.
Yeah, no, I from what I've rewatched recently, I would definitely agree with that. So he, takes care of all of Murray's guys, and Ram, is nervous, right, about being apprehended by the authorities. And, Superman has this moment with him where it's like, listen, you need to fix what you did, right? And they hear the knock at the door, and Superman's like, well, don't worry, like nothing, I give you my word, like you'll be okay. And then he runs away. And again, I'm just thinking if I'm Ram, he's already had this one instance where Superman comes in, presumably bends those bars back as he leaves, and now, tells him it's going to be okay, but doesn't stick around. Of course, we know he's changing into Clark, and it's not even the authorities. It's Perry
It's
and
Perry
Lois
and Lois and Jimmy and Wayne.
And that's when, of course, we get the revelation that he can fix what he's done, and Clark shows up, and if there's one off note.
Is it the platitude at the end?
Yeah, where Lois makes a remark about how, Ram being able to undo what had been done with those pressure points is like magic. And there's Clark saying, like the only real magic, the magic of knowledge.
That drives me nuts. What
was that?
That drives me nuts. I thought about that when I was driving over to your home. Like, well, wait a minute. That is so contradictory, right? What did you guys need? You wanted to have a bookend and close it, right? The only real magic, the magic of knowledge. That is so, look, magic is mysterious and things that can't be explained, and knowledge is stuff that can be explained. That's why it's knowledge.
Yeah, look, I can appreciate they were probably like, we need a button for this episode. Like, we need something to get us out. I feel like some sort of, wrestling pun or something like that. Something would have sufficed there. But
yeah,
I'll be honest, I love this. Like I said, that was really the only, again, other than what we talked about, a problematic depiction of the Ram character. But other than that, really from a story perspective, that was really the only thing where I cringed and I'm like, oh man, like that's pretty lame. But otherwise, I really enjoyed it. Before we give our rating, our Fedora rating, was there anything else that we were pretty thorough? Was there anything that we missed? Any aspects of the episode that we didn't discuss that you wanted to?
I can't think of anything.
All right, then it's time. Out of 5 Fedoras, how many would you give No Holds Barred?
Either 3.5 or 4.
Okay, right on. Well, you got to pick.
Oh, okay. Then
I almost let you go. But
in
I'm
that
like,
range,
no.
in that range, I'm ambivalent, right? Well, is it graded against the first season or the entire series?
Oh, that's a good question. No one's asked that yet. I guess.
See, while you're thinking about that, there's a lot of good episodes in season 1. The Mind Machine, The Stolen Costumes, The Secret of Superman, Crime Wave.
Your question is more than valid. I guess in my mind, I've been looking at it as kind of just like a absolute scale, really against the whole series. Like in my mind, from the color episodes that I've seen, I expect those will be my lower rated ones as we're moving forward. So I am sort of taking them into account as I'm thinking about mine.
On the generous side, I'd say 4. But part of me is leaning towards 3.5.
Okay. You know what? I don't know. I feel like maybe I'm just being generous. Maybe I'm just so happy to have you here in studio to having this conversation.
Or an interesting Perry episode where you saw these nuances and shades of Perry. I mean, the wrestling background kind of turned me off.
Okay.
It looked kitschy, compared to the 50s. I loved the stuff with the growth of Perry or the other aspects of Perry. I thought the portrayal of Ram, I'm looking through it through today's eyes. And geez, Anthony, I don't know. I can't give you one single number. It's going to be 3.5 to 4.
Okay. I'm gonna say a strong 4 for me, like a strong 4. I really.
Can I ask? Have you given out so far? You've done what, 10 or 11 or 12 of these? Have you given out any 5s?
I gave out a 5 for the Mind Machine.
Really?
I believe. As I'm getting deeper into this, I say to myself, I really need to be writing down what my ratings are. Or maybe there's some audience member out there who's been tallying them. That'd be great.
So you gave Mind Machine a 5.
Yeah, I really liked. I think that was the one that I gave a 5. I'd have to go back and check. I've given Night of Terror I rated very highly. I forget where that came in. Superman on Earth was very high. I was a little stingier though at the beginning. I've loosened up a little bit. As initially I was saying to myself, well, I know what my fives are. Like I know what my absolute favorite episodes of the entire series are. So if it's not that, then it can't be a 5. And I was like, that might be a little bit too stringent. So it can kind of ease off a little bit. And so I've been a little more generous. But I'm going to say a strong 4 for this. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it a lot. And the Perry stuff went a long way for me. And again, just kind of getting even the barest hint of any kind of romantic interest from anyone on the show.
Well, yeah. I'm pondering, so...
I think it's a 3.5 for you. I don't want to speak for you, but I feel like in terms of what you've expressed, I feel like, and that's okay. Let me ask you this, because, there's another episode that we're going to be talking about, and, maybe you could kind of use that as sort of a basis of comparison.
Again, I've got things I like in that, and there's a broader delta between what I like and what I dislike. I don't want to, I want to let us get through it, and I'm more definitive on my grade on that one. But now you're making... See, here's my dilemma. There's a lot of, I think, extremely good episodes in season 1. And they're my favorite episodes. As you know, there's 2 in season 2 that I would watch them 50 times, each of them, and they're always going to get a 5.
Yeah.
There's some extremely good ones, like Superman on Earth, for what they did in 22 minutes was phenomenal.
I think I gave Superman on Earth like a 3.5. I have to go back and listen to that again. Look, I'm refining.
You were stingier at the start.
I'm refining the rating system. In having this conversation, I think it seems like I think I probably enjoyed it a little bit more than you did. So if I give it a 4 and you give it a 3.5, I think that tracks. But don't sweat it. It's I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, listen. I'm going to listen now. I've only listened so far to 2 of your The Adventures Continue, or another exciting episode. I'm going to go back and just listen to like the last 5 or 6 minutes and see what you ascribed to each of them. I agree with you on the Mind Machine. I agree on that, because if I may, not only the action, but kind of my ability to suspend disbelief was that guy had a machine that could see 25 miles away.
I know. But all right, look, I'm trying to end the show here.
Sorry, we're done.
So Rich lands somewhere between 3.5 and 4, and that's fine. We had one of our guests tweaked the system, and I allowed it. Gave something X number of fedoras and a tie. So he started throwing. He wasn't ready to give like a full other fedora,
please,
but
that's too much variance.
Okay, I
too much variability.
I won't throw that in. But all right, you're somewhere in that range.
I'll give it 3.5, but a silk bathrobe.
Perfect. Then you know what? And that's how you put a button on an episode. Excellent. All right. Thank you. This really was a lot of fun. Really, really, truly, I enjoyed this. So thank you, Rich. Thank you, audience. As always, we will be back in 2 weeks with the next installment of another exciting episode. Adventures await. This show is part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network, home to Digging for Kryptonite, another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman, Summoning the Zords, and My Comic Shop History, available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review today. Sign up at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato for additional content. Thank you all.